The Critical Path, an essay on the social context of literary criticism by Northop Frye. Part 1. The phrase the critical path is, I understand, a term in business administration, and was one that I began hearing extensively used during the preparations for the Montreal Expo of 1967. It associated itself in my mind with the closing sentences of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, where he says that dogmatism and skepticism have both had it as tenable philosophical positions, and that the critical path is alone open. It also associated itself with a turning point in my own development. About 25 years ago, when still in middle life, I lost my way in the dark wood of Blake's prophecies and looked around for some path that would get me out of there. There were many paths, some well-trodden and equipped with signposts, but all pointing in what for me were the wrong directions. They directed me to the social conditions of Blake's time, to the history of the occult tradition, to psychological factors in Blake's mind, and other subjects, quite valid in themselves. But my task was the specific one of trying to crack Blake's symbolic code, and I had a feeling that the way to that led directly through literature itself. The critical path I wanted was a theory of criticism, which would, first, account for the major phenomena of literary experience, and second, would lead to some view of the place of literature in civilization as a whole. Following the bent that Blake had given me, I became particularly interested in two questions. One was, what is the total subject of study of which criticism forms part? I rejected the answer, criticism is a subdivision of literature, because it was such obvious nonsense. Criticism is the theory of literature, not a minor and non-essential element in its practice. This latter notion of it is not surprising in outsiders or in poets, but how a critic himself can be so confused about his function as to take the same view I could not and cannot yet understand. Of course, criticism has a peculiar disability in the number of people who have drifted into it without any vocation for it, and who may therefore have, however unconsciously, some interest in keeping it theoretically incoherent. Literary criticism, in its turn, seemed to be a part of two larger but undeveloped subjects. One was the unified criticism of all the arts. The other was some area of verbal expression which had not yet been defined, and which in the present book is called mythology. The latter seemed more immediately promising. The former, I felt, was the ultimate destiny of the subject called aesthetics, in which, at least at that time, relatively few technically competent literary critics appeared to be much interested. I noticed also the strong centrifugal drift from criticism toward social, philosophical, and religious interests, which had set in at least as early as Coleridge. Some of this seemed to me badly motivated. A critic devoting himself to literature, but without any sense of his distinctive function, is often tempted to feel that he can never be anything more than a second-class writer or thinker, because his work is derived from the work of what by his postulates are greater men. I felt then that a conception of criticism was needed, which would set the critic's activity in its proper light, and that once we had that, a critic's other interests would represent a natural expansion of criticism rather than an escape from it. The other question was, how do we arrive at poetic meaning? It is a generally accepted principle that meaning is derived from context. But there are two contexts for verbal meaning: the imaginative context of literature and the context of ordinary intentional discourse. I felt that no critic had given his full attention to what seemed to me to be the first operation of criticism, trying to see what meaning could be discovered in works of literature from their context in literature. All meaning in literature seemed to be referred, first of all, to the context of intentional meaning, always a secondary and sometimes the wrong context. That is, the primary meaning of a literary work was assumed to be the kind of meaning that a prose paraphrase could represent. This primary meaning was called the literal meaning, a phrase with a luxuriant growth of semantic tangles around it, which I have discussed elsewhere and return to more briefly here. When I first began to write on critical theory, I was startled to realize how general was the agreement that criticism had no presuppositions of its own, but had to be grounded on some other subject. The disagreements were not over that, but over the question of what the proper subjects were that criticism ought to depend on. The older European philological basis, a very sound one, at least in the form in which it was expounded by August Buck and others in the 19th century, had largely disappeared in English-speaking countries. In some places, notably Oxford, where I studied in the 30s, it had declined into a much narrower conception of philology. This was partly because the shifting of the center of literary study from the classical to the modern languages had developed a prejudice derived from one of the more bizarre perversions of the work ethic, that English literature at least was a merely entertaining subject and should not be admitted to universities unless the main emphasis fell on something more beneficial to the moral fiber, like learning the classes of Old English strong verbs. In most North American universities, the critical establishment rested on a mixture of history and philosophy, evidently on the assumption that every work of literature is what Sir Walter Raleigh said Paradise Lost was, a monument to dead ideas. I myself was soon identified as one of the critics who took their assumptions from anthropology and psychology, then still widely regarded as the wrong subjects. I have always insisted that criticism cannot take presuppositions from elsewhere, which always means wrenching them out of their real context, and must work out its own. But mental habits are hard to break, especially bad habits, and because I found the term archetype an essential one, I am still often called a Jungian critic and classified with Miss Maud Bodkin, whose book I have read with interest, but whom, on the evidence of that book, I resemble about as closely as I resemble the late Sarah Bernhardt. The reason for this rather silly situation was obvious enough. As long as the meaning of a poem, let us say for short, is sought primarily within the context of intentional discourse, it becomes a document to be related to some verbal area of study outside literature. Hence, criticism, like Los Angeles, becomes an aggregate of suburbs with no central area in literature itself. One of these suburbs is the biographical one, where the literary work is taken to be a document illustrating something in the writer's life. The theory demands that Shakespeare, for instance, should be an obviously and overwhelmingly great man, which is why so much 19th century critical energy was expended in trying to invent a sufficiently interesting biography for Shakespeare out of fancied allusions in the poetry. This misguided industry has now largely been restricted to the sonnets, where, as Mutt says in Finnegan's Wake, he who runes may read it on all fours. This misguided industry has now largely been restricted to the sonnets, where, as Mutt says in Finnegan's Wake, he who runes may read it on all fours. Carlyle's essay on Shakespeare, in Heroes and Hero Worship, comes as close to pure verbiage, to rhetoric without content, as prose sentences can in the nature of things get. Something seems to be wrong with the theory, at least in this form. One is better off with Goethe, but even there, the sense of personal greatness may be connected less with the quality of the poetry than with the number of things Goethe had been able to do besides writing poetry. I am not talking here about real biography, but about the assumption that the poet's life is the essential key to the deeper understanding of the poetry. It often happens that interesting literature is produced by an uninteresting man. In fact, it happens so often that there is clearly no correlation between the ability to write poetry and any other ability, or at least it is clearly absurd to assume that every real poet must be a certain kind of person. Hence the formula. This poem is particularly notable for the way in which it throws light on, etc., soon ceases to carry much conviction for all but a selected group of poets. Something else, more deeply founded in wider literary experience, is needed for critical understanding. In these days, a biographical approach is likely to move from the manifest to the latent personal content of the poem, and from a biographical approach, properly speaking, to a psychological one. At the present time and place, this means very largely a Freudian, or what I think of as a Luther on the privy approach. A considerable amount of determinism enters at this stage. All documentary conceptions of literature are allegorical conceptions of it, and this fact becomes even more obvious when poems are taken to be allegories of Freudian repressions, unresolved conflicts, or tensions between ego and id, or, for another school, of the Jungian process of individuation. But what is true of allegorical poetry is equally true of allegorical criticism, that allegory is a technique calling for tact. Tact is violated when the whiteness of Moby Dick is explained as a Lockean tabula rasa, or when Alice in Wonderland is discussed in terms of her hypothetical toilet training, or when Matthew Arnold's line in Dover Beach, where ignorant armies clash by night, is taken as a covert reference to the copulation of his parents. One is reminded of the exempla from natural history made by medieval preachers. According to Richard Rolla, in the 14th century, the bee carries earth in its feet to ballast itself when it flies, and thereby reminds us of the incarnation, when God took up an earthly form. The example is ingenious and entertaining, and only unsatisfying if one happens to be interested in bees. If we tire of the shadow play of explaining real poems by assumed mental states, we may be driven to realize that the ultimate source of a poem is not so much the individual poet as the social situation from which he springs, and of which he is the spokesman and the medium. This takes us into the area of historical criticism. Here again, no one can or should deny the relevance of literature to history, but only rarely in historical criticism is there any real sense of the fact that literature is itself an active part of the historical process. Poets are assumed to have a sensitive litmus paper response to social trends. Hence, literature, as a whole, is taken to be something that the historical process acts on, and we still have not escaped from a documentary and allegorical procedure. Once more, some historical critics, like the biographical ones, will want to go from manifest to latent social content, from the historical context of the poem to its context in some unified overview of history. Here again, determinism, the impulse to find the ultimate meaning of literature in something that is not literature, is unmistakable. At the time of which I am speaking, a generation ago, a conservative Catholic determinism was fashionable, strongly influenced by Eliot, which adopted Thomism, or at least made references to it, as the summit of Western cultural values, and looked down benignantly on everything that followed it as a kind of toboggan slide, rushing through nominalism, Protestantism, liberalism, subjective idealism, and so on to the solipsism in which the critics' non-Thomist contemporaries were assumed to be enclosed. Marxism is another enlarged historical perspective, widely adopted, and perhaps inherently the most serious one of them all. Literature is a part of a social process. Hence, that process as a whole forms the genuine context of literature. Theoretically, Marxism takes a social view of literature, which is comprehensive enough to see it within this genuine context. In practice, however, Marxism operates as merely one more determinism, which avoids every aspect of literature except one allegorical interpretation of its content. All these documentary and external approaches, even when correctly handled, are subject to at least three limitations, which every experienced scholar has to reckon with. In the first place, they do not account for the literary form of what they are discussing. Identifying Edward King and documenting Milton's attitude to the Church of England will throw no light on Lycidas as a pastoral elegy with specific classical and Italian lines of ancestry. Secondly, they do not account for the poetic and metaphorical language of the literary work, but assume its primary meaning to be a non-poetic meaning. Thirdly, they do not account for the fact that the genuine quality of a poet is often in a negative relation to the chosen context. To understand Blake's Milton and Jerusalem, it is useful to know something of his quarrel with Haley and his sedition trial, but one also needs to be aware of the vast disproportion between these minor events in a quiet life and their apocalyptic transformation in the poems. One should also know enough of criticism as well as of Blake not to ascribe the disproportion to paranoia on Blake's part. Similarly, a scholar may write a whole shelf of books about the life of Milton, studied in connection with the history of his time, and still fail to notice that Milton's greatness as a poet has a good deal to do with his profound and perverse misunderstanding of the history of his time. By the time I began writing criticism, the so-called new criticism had established itself as a technique of explication. This was a rhetorical form of criticism, and from the beginning, rhetoric has meant two things: the figuration of language and the persuasive powers of an orator. New criticism dealt with rhetoric in the former sense and established a counterweight to the biographical approach, which treated poetry as a personal rhetoric. The great merit of explicatory criticism was that it accepted poetic language and form as the basis for poetic meaning. On this basis, it built up a resistance to all background criticism that explained the literary in terms of the non-literary. At the same time, it deprived itself of the great strength of documentary criticism, the sense of context. It simply explicated one work after another, paying little attention to genre or to any larger structural principles connecting the different works explicated. The limitations of this approach soon became obvious, and most of the new critics, sooner or later, fell back on one of the established documentary contexts, generally the historical one, although they were regarded at first as anti-historical. One or two have even been Marxists, but in general the movement, at least in America, was anti-Marxist. Marxists had previously condemned the somewhat similar tendency in Russian criticism, called formalism, because they realized that if they began by conceding literary form as the basis for literary significance, the assumptions on which Marxist bureaucracies rationalized their censorship of the arts would be greatly weakened. They would logically have to end, in fact, in giving poets and novelists the same kind of freedom that they had reluctantly been compelled to grant to the physical scientists. More recently, Marshall McLuhan has placed a formalist theory, expressed in the phrase, "the medium is the message," within the context of a neo-Marxist determinism in which communication media play the same role that instruments of production do in more orthodox Marxism. Professor McLuhan drafted his new Mosaic Code under a strong influence from the conservative wing of the new critical movement, and many traces of an earlier Thomist determinism can be found in the Gutenberg galaxy. An example is the curiously exaggerated distinction he draws between the manuscript culture of the Middle Ages and the book culture of the printed page that followed it. It seemed to me obvious that, after accepting the poetic form of a poem as its primary basis of meaning, the next step was to look for its context within literature itself. And of course, the most obvious literary context for a poem is the entire output of its author. Just as explication, by stressing the more objective aspect of rhetoric, had formed a corrective to the excesses of biographical criticism, so a study of a poet's whole work might form the basis of a kind of psychological criticism that would operate within literature and so provide some balance for the kind that ends in the bosom of Freud. Poetry is, after all, a technique of communication. It engages the conscious part of the mind as well as the murkier areas, and what a poet succeeds in communicating to others is at least as important as what he fails to resolve for himself. We soon become aware that every poet has his own distinctive structure of imagery, which usually emerges even in his earliest work, and which does not and cannot essentially change. This larger context of the poem, within its author's entire mental landscape, is assumed in all the best explication. Spitzer's, for example. I became aware of its importance myself when working on Blake as soon as I realized that Blake's special symbolic names and the like did form a genuine structure of poetic imagery, and not, despite his use of the word, a system to which he was bound like an administrator to a computer. The structure of imagery, however, as I continued to study it, began to show an increasing number of similarities to the structures of other poets. Blake had always been regarded as a poet with a private symbolism locked up in his own mind. But this conception of him was so fantastically untrue that overcoming it carried me much further than merely correcting a mistaken notion of Blake. I was led to three conclusions in particular. First, there is no private symbolism. The phrase makes no sense. There may be private allusions or associations that need footnotes, but they cannot form a poetic structure, even if the poet himself is a psychotic. The structure of the poem remains an effort at communication, however utterly it may fail to communicate. Secondly, as just said, every poet has his own structure of imagery, every detail of which has its analogue in that of all other poets. Third, when we follow out this pattern of analogous structures, we find that it leads not to similarity, but to identity. Similarity implies uniformity and monotony, and any conclusion that all poets are much alike in whatever respect is too false to our literary experience to be tenable. It is identity that makes individuality possible. Poems are made out of the same images, just as poems in English are all made out of the same language. This contrast of similarity and identity is one of the most difficult problems in critical theory, and we shall have to return to it several times in this book. I was still not satisfied. I wanted a historical approach to literature, but an approach that would be or include a genuine history of literature and not simply the assimilating of literature to some other kind of history. It was at this point that the immense importance of certain structural elements in the literary tradition, such as conventions, genres, and the recurring use of certain images or image clusters, which I came to call archetypes, forced itself on me. T.S. Eliot had already spoken of tradition as a creative and informing power, operating on the poet specifically as a craftsman, and not vaguely as a merely cultivated person. But neither he nor anyone else seemed to get to the point of identifying the factors of that tradition, of what it is that makes possible the creation of new works of literature out of earlier ones. The new critics had resisted the background approach to criticism, but they had not destroyed the oratorical conception of poetry as a personal rhetoric. And yet, convention within literature seemed to be a force even stronger than history. The difference between the conventions of medieval poets writing in the London of Richard II and those of Cavalier poets writing in the London of Charles II is far less than the difference in social conditions between the two ages. I began to suspect that a poet's relation to poetry was much more like a scholar's relation to his scholarship than was generally thought. Whatever one is producing, the psychological processes involved seem much the same. The scholar cannot be a scholar until he immerses himself in his subject, until he attaches his own thinking to the body of what is thought in his day about that subject. A scholar, qua scholar, cannot think for himself or think at random. He can only expand an organic body of thought, add something logically related to what he or someone else has already thought. But this is precisely the way that poets have always talked about their relation to poetry. From Homer onward, poets have continually insisted that they were simply places where something new in literature was able to take its own shape. From here, it is clear that one has to take a final step. Criticism must develop a sense of history within literature to complement the historical criticism that relates literature to its non-literary historical background. Similarly, it must develop its own form of historical overview on the basis of what is inside literature rather than outside it. Instead of fitting literature into a prefabricated scheme of history, the critic should see literature as a coherent structure, historically conditioned, but shaping its own history, responding to, but not determined in its form by an external historical process. This total body of literature can be studied through its larger structural principles, which I have just described, as conventions, genres, and recurring image groups or archetypes. These structural principles are largely ignored by most social critics. Their treatment of literature, in consequence, is usually superficial, a matter of picking things out of literary works that seem interesting for non-literary reasons. When criticism develops a proper sense of the history of literature, the history beyond literature does not cease to exist or to be relevant to the critic. Similarly, seeing literature as a unity in itself does not withdraw it from a social context. On the contrary, it becomes far easier to see what its place in civilization is. Criticism will always have two aspects. One turned toward the structure of literature, and one turned toward the other cultural phenomena that form the social environment of literature. Together, they balance each other. When one is worked on to the exclusion of the other, the critical perspective goes out of focus. If criticism is in proper balance, the tendency of critics to move from critical to larger social issues becomes more intelligible. Such a movement need not and should not be due to a dissatisfaction with the narrowness of criticism as a discipline, but should be simply the result of a sense of social context, a sense present in all critics from whom one is in the least likely to learn anything. There was another difficulty with the new criticism, which was only a technical one, but still pointed to the necessity for a sense of context. Whenever we read anything, there are two mental operations we perform which succeed one another in time. First, we follow the narrative movement in the act of reading, turning over the pages and pursuing the trail from top left to bottom right. Afterwards, we look at the work as a simultaneous unity and study its structure. This latter act is the critical response, properly speaking. The ordinary reader seldom needs to bother with it. The chief material of rhetorical analysis consists of a study of the poetic texture, and such a study plunges one into a complicated labyrinth of ambiguities, multiple meanings, recurring images, and echoes of both sound and sense. A full explication of a long and complex work, which was based on the reading process, could well become much longer and more difficult to read than the work itself. Such linear explications have some advantages as a teaching technique, but for publishing purposes, it is more practicable to start with the second stage. This involves attaching the rhetorical analysis to a deductive framework derived from a study of the structure, and the context of that structure is what shows us where we should begin to look for our central images and ambiguities. The difficulty in transferring explication from the reading process to the study of structure has left some curious traces in new critical theory. One of them is in Ransom, with his arbitrary assumption that texture is somehow more important for the critic than structure. Another is again in McLuhan, who has expanded the two unresolved factors of explication into a portentous historical contrast between the linear demands of the old printed media and the simultaneous impact of the new electronic ones. The real distinction, however, is not between different kinds of media, but between the two operations of the mind which are employed in every contact with every medium. There is a simultaneous response to print. There is a linear response to a painting. For there is a preliminary dance of the eye before we take in the whole picture. Music at the opposite end of experience has its score, the spatial presentation symbolizing a simultaneous understanding of it. In reading a newspaper, there are two preliminary linear operations: the glance over the headlines and the following down of a story. This point is crucial for critical theory because the whole prose paraphrase conception of literal meaning is based on an understanding which is really pre-critical. It is while we are striving to take in what is being presented to us that we are reducing the poetic to the intentional meaning, attending to what the work explicitly says rather than to what it is. The pre-critical experience of literature is wordless, and all criticism which attempts to ground itself on such experience tends to assume that the primary critical act is a wordless reaction, to be described in some metaphor of immediate and nonverbal contact, such as taste. Verbal criticism, in this view, is a secondary operation of trying to find words to describe the taste. Students who have been encouraged to think along these lines often ask me why I pay so little attention to the uniqueness of a work of literature. It may be absurd that unique should become a value term, the world's worst poem being obviously as unique as any other, but the word brings out the underlying confusion of thought very clearly. Criticism is a structure of knowledge, and the unique, as such, is unknowable. Uniqueness is a quality of experience, not of knowledge, and of precisely the aspect of experience which cannot form part of a structure of knowledge. A better word, such as individuality, would raise deeper problems. The basis of critical knowledge is the direct experience of literature, certainly. But experience, as such, is never adequate. We are always reading Paradise Lost with a hangover, or seeing King Lear with an incompetent Cordelia, or disliking a novel because some scene in it connects with something suppressed in our memories, and our most deeply satisfying responses are often made in childhood, to be seen later as immature overreacting. The right occasion, the right mood, the right state of development to meet the occasion can hardly coincide more than once or twice in a lifetime. Nevertheless, the conception of a definitive experience in time seems to be the hypothesis on which criticism is based. Criticism, surely, is designed to reconstruct the kind of experience that we could and should have had, and thereby to bring us into line with that experience, even if the shadow of Eliot's The Hollow Men has forever darkened it. As a structure of knowledge, then, criticism, like other structures of knowledge, is in one sense a monument to a failure of experience. A Tower of Babel, or one of the ruins of time, which in Blake's phrase builds mansions in eternity. Hence the popularity of the evaluative or taste criticism, which seems to point backwards to a greater intensity of response than the criticism itself can convey. It corresponds to a popular view of poetry itself, that whatever the poet writes down is merely salvaged from an original inspiration of a much more numinous kind. There is a real truth here, though it needs to be differently stated. There are two categories of response to literature which could well be described by Schiller's terms, naive and sentimental, if used in his sense, but transferred from qualities inherent in literature to qualities in the experience of it. The naive experience is the one we are now discussing, the linear, participating, pre-critical response, which is thrown forward to the conclusion of the work as the reader turns pages or the theater audience expectantly listens. The conclusion is not simply the last page or spoken line, but the recognition which, in a work of fiction particularly, brings the end into line with the beginning and pulls the straight line of response around into a parabola. A pure, self-contained pleasure of participating response is the end at which all writers aim who think of themselves as primarily entertainers, and some of them ignore, resist, or resent the critical operation that follows it. Such pleasure is, however, a state of innocence rarely attained in adult life. Many of us have favorite authors who set up for us a kind of enclosed garden in which we can wander in a state of completely satisfied receptivity. But for each reader, there are very few of these, and they are usually discovered and read fairly early. The sense of guilt about reading escape literature is a moral anxiety mainly derived from a feeling that it is a substitute for an unattained experience, and that if escape literature really did what it professes to do, it would not be escape literature. As a rule, our pleasure in direct response is of a more muted and disseminated kind. It arises from a habit of reading or theater going, and much of this pleasure comes from a greatly enlarged kind of expectation, extending over many works and many years. Instead of trying to operate the gambling machine of an ideal experience, which may never pay off, we are building something up, accumulating a total fund of experience, each individual response being an investment in it. It is a central function of criticism to explain what is going on in the habit of reading, using reading as a general term for all literary experience. If reading forms simply an unconnected series of experiences, one novel or play or poem after another, it would have the sense of distraction or idle time-filling about it, which so many of those who are afraid of leisure believe it to have. The real reader knows better. He knows that he is entering into a coherent structure of experience, and the criticism which studies literature through its organizing patterns of convention, genre, and archetype enables him to see such criticism can hardly injure the uniqueness of each experience. On the contrary, it rejects the evaluating hierarchy that limits us to the evaluator's reading list and encourages each reader to accept no substitutes in his search for infinite variety. It is simply not true that the great writers supply all the varieties of experience offered by the merely good ones. If Messenger is not a substitute for Shakespeare, neither is Shakespeare a substitute for Messenger. Still less does the study of the recurring structural patterns of literature lead the reader to the conviction that literature is everywhere much alike. For such study, as just said, does not keep bringing the student back to similar points, but to the same point, to the sense of an identity in literary experience which is the objective counterpart to his own identity. That variety and novelty can be found only at the place of identity is the theme of much of the most influential writing in our century, of the Eliot quartets with their garlic and sapphires clotting a bedded axle tree, of the pound cantos which insist on making it new, but remain at the center of the unwobbling pivot, of that tremendous hymn to the eternal newness of the same, which is Finnegan's Wake. 20th century criticism which does not understand a central theme of the literature of its own time can hardly be expected to make much sense of the literature of the past. This brings us to the sentimental type of response, which starts where criticism starts, with the unity of the work being read. In modern literature, there has been a strong emphasis on demanding a response from the reader which minimizes everything naive, everything connected with suspense or expectation. This emphasis begins in English literature with the Blake prophecies, Milton and Jerusalem particularly, which avoid the sense of linear narration and keep repeating the central theme in an expanding series of contexts. Fiction tends increasingly to abolish the teleological plot which keeps the reader wondering how it turns out. Poetry drops its connective tissue of narrative in favor of discontinuous episodes. In Mallarmé and elsewhere, it even avoids the centrifugal movement of naming or pointing to objects thought of as external to the poem. The emphasis, though it starts with unity, is not on unity for its own sake, but on intensity, a word which brings us back to the conception of an ideal experience. Hopkins with his inscape and in-stress, Proust with his instance of remembrance and recognition, Eliot with his timeless moments at the world's axis, and a host of more recent writers with their mystiques of orgasm, drugs, and quasi-Buddhist moments of enlightenment are all talking about a form of ideal experience, which in one way or another seems to be the real goal of life. The ideal experience itself, for the shrewder of these writers at least, never occurs. But with intense practice and concentration, a deeply satisfying approximation may occur, very rarely. The curious link with religion, for even writers who are not religious still often employ religious terminology or symbolism in this connection, as Joyce and Proust do, indicates that this direct analogy of ideal experience is typically the way of the mystic or saint rather than the artist. An occupation for the saint, as Eliot calls it, though he immediately adds that it cannot be in any sense an occupation. Traditional Christian thought had an explanation for the dilemma of experience which at least made sense within its own postulates. According to it, Adam was capable of a preternatural power of experience before his fall, and we have lost this capacity. Our structures of reason and imagination are therefore analogical constructs designed to recapture within the mental processes that belong to our present state something of a lost directness of apprehension. Thus, Milton can define education as an attempt to repair the ruin of our first parents by regaining to know God aright. Similar language continues in our own day. Proust concludes his colossal analysis of experience by saying that the only paradises are lost paradises. Yeats, in a much more light-hearted way, tells us in Solomon and the Witch, anticipating the more recent orgasm cults, that a single act of perfect intercourse would restore the unfallen world. In this view, literature, philosophy, and religion, at least, are all articulate analogies of an experience that goes not only beyond articulateness, but beyond human capacity as well. The Christian fallen world is only one form of a conception which has run through human imagination and thought from earliest times to the present, according to which the existing world is, so to speak, the lower level of being or reality. Above it is a world which may not exist. We do not actually know that it exists, even if we seem to have an experience of it. But is not nothing or non-existence, is not a merely ideal world because it can act as an informing principle of existence, and yet cannot convincingly be assigned to any intermediate category of existence, such as the potential. This world, relegated by analogy to the intelligible world of the philosopher and scientist, the imaginable world of the poet, and the revealed world of religion, is increasingly referred to in our day by the term model. In religion, as noted, this model world is usually projected as an actually existing world created by God, though at present out of human reach. In philosophy, it appears in such concepts as Aristotle's final cause, and in the more uninhibited structures of the poets, it is the idealized world of romance, pastoral, or apocalyptic vision. As such, it suggests a world with which we should wish to identify ourselves, or something in ourselves. And so it becomes the world indicated by the analogy of ideal experience just mentioned. A direct experience or apprehension of such a world would be a microcosmic experience, an intelligence or imagination finding itself at the center of an intelligible or imaginable totality, and so experiencing, for however brief an instant, without any residue of alienation. It would thus also be an experience of finally attained or recovered identity. Most of us, at least, never reach it directly in experience, if it is attainable in experience at all, but only through one of the articulated analogies, of which literature is a central one. Whatever it is, it represents the end of our critical path, though we have not as yet traversed the path. As we proceed to do this, we must keep to a middle way between two uncritical extremes. One is the centrifugal fallacy of determinism, the feeling that literature lacks a social reference unless its structure is ignored and its content associated with something non-literary. No theory is any good unless it explains facts, but theory and facts have to be in the same plane. Psychological and political theories can explain only psychological and political facts. No literary facts can be explained by anything except a literary theory. I remember a student interested in Victorian period who dismissed several standard critical works in that area as totally lacking in any sense of social awareness. I eventually learned that social awareness, for him, meant the amount of space given in the book, whatever the announced subject, to the Chartist movement. Chartism and similar social movements have their relevance to literature, certainly. But literature is all about something else, even when social protest is its explicit theme. The other extreme is the centripetal fallacy, where we fail to separate criticism from the pre-critical direct experience of literature. This leads to an evaluating criticism, which imposes the critic's own values derived from the prejudices and anxieties of his own time on the whole literature of the past. Criticism, like religion, is one of the sub-academic areas in which a large number of people are still free to indulge their anxieties instead of studying their subject. Any mention of this fact is apt to provoke the response, "Of course you don't understand how important our anxieties are." I understand it sufficiently to have devoted a good deal of this essay to the subject of social anxiety and its relation to genuine criticism. We notice that the two fallacies mentioned above turn out to be essentially the same fallacy, as opposed extremes so often do.